Welcome to EPG Pathshala. In last module, we discussed the mode of history writing that is called environmental history and examined relationship between nature and human beings in pre-colonial India. In this module, we will discuss 200 years period when the subcontinent first witnessed East India Company reconferring the natural resource use intensity and subsequently under the British rule. Rangarajan and Shivaramakrishnan talks about how the overarching perspective on India's environmental history sought to draw a sharp line in terms of the impact of colonial or British imperial economic policies, legislation and executive measures. They voice an opinion that partly due to the context and conditions of its flowering, much of India's environmental history, at least till the year 2000 or so, focused on forests. They suggest that forests, to an environmental historian, were and are contested spaces with different sets of humans crowding the stage or the forest floor, seeking to place their imprint on the landscape in different mutually contradictory ways. To list a few, the imperial ruler and the aesthete interested in wilderness as natural beauty or evidence of divine presence, the resource gatherer or rentier, those who felled trees or trapped animals, grazed cattle or collected honey, gleaned wood or set fire to create and cultivate sweeten plots. These were conflicting, overlapping, intersecting set of actors. Rangarajan and Shivaramakrishnan brings under academic scrutiny simple linear narratives of landscape transformations in the face of growing demographic pressures or state demands for resources and revenues. They express surprise that some of the most thoughtful synthetic historians such as Richard and Tucker in 1983 and Richards and Tucker in 1988 and Lutten in 1999 find it difficult to shake off such linear tendencies. Environmental history anthologies that appeared in late 1980s mostly brought under the spotlight the 1870s and 1880s and thereafter in order to narrate the tales of the enormity of the shifts in landscape. Environmental history scholars, taking inspiration from Arnold and Guha 1995, were taken in awe by the ways in which forests covering over 500,000 square kilometers of land were brought under governance by 1904 and managed by foresters as a magnificently unprecedented moment. It has been argued by Rangarajan and Shivaramakrishnan that the first major anthologies on nature and culture in the 1990s, drawing mostly on work done in the 1980s, had looked mainly at the imperial impact on the state-driven changes, or alternately at the multiple hues of the encounters of nature, the Orient and colonialism. They argue that anthologies that started to appear since the mid-1990s had presented a more nuanced treatment of the ways in which the colonial state had engaged with varying degrees of success in making agrarian landscape. We also find that environmental historians have often presented the Indian Forests Act 1868 by the British and their leaning towards German school of scientific forestry as the reasons for effecting restrictions on communities that accessed grazing in forests. They also point out at how colonial rulers who couldn't understand the rhythms of pastoral mobility and perceived these groups as threats to law and order had labeled them as criminal and denotified tribes. Irfan Habib suggests that even as the available data don't lead us to generate an exact forest map of the time around 1800, there is much evidence that even in the upper Gangetic basin, there were still forests. Quoting from 1837 text, forests in southern districts of Awadh, Habib states that such forests were situated within the agricultural zone and generally served the neighboring rural inhabitants, supplying them with fodder, firewood and timber. And similar was the case with pockets of forested country in the peninsula where such isolated jungle tracts bordered the cultivated zone. Describing the fate of the Himalaya and sub-mountain Tarai forests, those from the northeastern parts and in the Western Ghats, as well as other dense forests in central India, Irfan Habib talks about how there arose a brisk trade in timber that was logged by local communities and sold at neighboring marts. He also refers to the practice of floating down the logs thus obtained from the Himalaya forests through the Punjab rivers by middlemen or merchants. For environmental history centered on forests, Irfan Habib recommends, besides this fissured land and nature culture imperialism, Sumit Guha's work, Environment and Ethnicity in India, 1200 to 1991, which gives a comprehensive account of several forests connected community from present-day Maharashtra, southern Gujarat and central India. He also underlines a work published by a colonial author, William Wilson Hunter, in 1897 titled Annals of Rural Bengal, which presents the study of Santals in present-day Jharkhand state. Drawing upon the work of Sumit Guha, Rangarajan and Shivram Krishnan argues that larger landscape was the reverse of what exists today. Islands of intensive cultivation dotted by a vast ocean of forest. They propose that on a closer look, forests as a single unified category was in fact a mosaic of semi-natural landscapes with old growth and scrub jungle interspersed with tree-covered savannas and secondary growth. When the country passed under British occupation, the East India Company's officials framed no particular policy in regards to forests, and these were being looked at as landscapes to be depopulated by wild animals. In the early years, company officials actually declared rewards for hunting down the big cat, and these forests were to be cleared in order to facilitate colonization of them by extensive cultivation. Irfan Habib brings to our attention a prediction voiced by Donald Butler that once Awadh came fully under British control, all the minor forests would vanish there, and reminds that this was found to be quite well founded. Irfan Habib also alerts on the narrow understanding that consider ecology under colonialism as a matter mainly of what happened to forests and its traditional users. He stresses upon the need to understand and study the colonial experience as impacting all manifestations of natural resources and natural resource dependent lives, ranging from soil, irrigation, pastoral resources, wildlife and public health. Next to forests, what has occupied the continued engagement from environmental history scholarship on colonial India is riverine resources and perennial irrigation. As we discussed in the first module on environmental history, history of irrigation canals in India is a millennium-old phenomenon. But canals built during Mughal period were inundation canals that relied on monsoon floods. However, as Rangarajan and Shivaram Krishnan reminds us, canal construction on a vast scale gave British India arguably more acreage than any other political entity on earth. Irfan Habib draws our attention to late colonial period and specifically to years following 1858, when the British government began to show some interests in construction of canals, notably for growing crops required for export such as cotton and wheat, which especially needed to be watered by artificial means. He adds that by 1925 to 26, canal and other government-funded works served 11.8% of the entire net sown area of the British India. And of areas artificially irrigated, the canals served just over 51%, but wells generally owned by peasants still accounted for nearly a quarter, that is 24.2% of the irrigated area, and tanks were used to irrigate on another 13.1%. By mid-1990s, the environmental history scholarship had started to engage with the role of perennial irrigation, not merely as an input in cultivation, but as also an instrument of reconfiguration of social infrastructure through setting up of canal colonies in Punjab and Sindh. Environmental history scholars also looked at how colonial experts viewed mighty rivers of eastern part of India and the monsoonal floods and called the Koshi River sorrow of Bihar. Rohan D'Souza looks at the emergence of the idea of multipurpose river valley development projects in colonial Orissa, while much of the environmental history scholarship has also been alert to the negative impacts of perennial irrigation, such as soil degradation, interruptions to natural drainage, giving rise to disease vectors such as malaria-spreading mosquitoes and waterlogging, they appear to have ignored the impact of perennial irrigation canals on the cattle breeding tracts. In 1907, writing about Montgomery and Sindh breeds of cattle, J. Mollison and L. French alerted, and I quote, "A vast extension of canal irrigation has taken place in neighboring districts across the Ravi River, and many good cows have been taken and sold by their owners into the new Chenab Canal colony. The breeding of Montgomery cattle is likely to suffer unless special precautions are taken to maintain the purity of the breed, because the extraordinary prosperity of Chenab Canal colony across the Ravi has diverted the attention of the nomadic Bar tribes to the profits derived from agriculture when assisted by canal irrigation. It is also to be remembered that the whole of the Bar tracts of the Montgomery districts are destined within the next few years to receive irrigation from the projected Lower Bari Doab Canal." Unquote. Similarly, presenting a note on cattle breeding, W. Smith, an imperial dairy expert, had described to colleagues at a meeting of the Agriculture Committee of Bombay Presidency at Pune in 1927 how the quality of milch cattle available in India, including in Punjab, but excluding Sindh, had become much worse than those available some 26 years ago, when he had just arrived in British India to work with newly opened military dairy farms department. Amongst several reasons that Smith highlights in that note was the spread of irrigation canals. 10 years after Smith voiced such an opinion on how extension of irrigation with perennial canals had adversely affected the cattle breeds, Norman C. Wright reiterated this view by stating, quote, "At present, there is very general impression that the introduction of irrigation rapidly leads to the deterioration and even to the virtual extinction of good breeds of cattle. This, for example, is true of Sindh and of certain tracts of United Provinces. If full advantage is to be derived from irrigation, I am convinced that farming in irrigated areas will have to be modified to allow the inclusion of mixed farming systems in which both crop and animal husbandry play their part." Describing the impulse of the mission of writing a nationalist environmental history and the clarity provided by a moral imperative, Rangarajan and Shivaram Krishnan states that this impulse led environmental historians during the early phase to undertake the task of adding to the record of colonial infamy the evidence pertaining to the despoliation of nature and destruction of tribal culture carried out by the British. However, we need to underline the fact that all colonial officers did not share the high modernism and condescending attitude towards natives. Some agriculture and animal husbandry experts such as James Mollison, E.J. Bruin, D. Clouston, and W. Smith spoke and wrote with much appreciation about the skills of nomadic cattle breeders. A survey that Fraser Darling penned while heading Commonwealth Animal Genetic Bureau starts with acknowledgement that, I quote, "Throughout the history of colonial development, and particularly in that of British colonization, we find that settlers and governments alike have attempted either to raise animals of the homeland in the new territories or to improve the existing stocks and conditions to a state comparable with that of the mother country. Both of these aims have been attended by some spectacular successes and some conspicuous failures. It would seem that only too often has the appraising eye of the stock breeder with his European standards of excellence made him follow dangerous paths with a surer knowledge of the relations between environment, structure, and functions would have prevented. However, there is a growing new knowledge not only of animals' economic destiny, but of the varying nutritional conditions and the metabolic responses of different animal types to this, and of the fundamental genetic knowledge lying behind traditional breeding practices. As yet, we can hardly measure the significance of the work of such men as Rattray in West Africa and Evans Pritchard in Sudan, but their practical anthropological research must be of considerable value. However, in India, as late as in 1991, Sherin Ratnagar pointed out that there existed only a few ethnographies of the various animal rearing groups in the country. These remarks by a scholar who went on to remain not just in service of the empire, being the director of Commonwealth Bureau of Animal Genetics, but had his moments of conflicting viewpoints with British imperial powers and carved out Human Ecology School of Academic Scholarship, suggests that environmental history of colonial India must also try and make a sense of how was that experience similar to the experience that other colonies underwent, and how different was it from the experience that other dominion landscapes underwent in last 2 centuries. Similarly, Rangarajan and Shivram Krishnan argues out a case for viewing colonial India in a larger geographical frame. It is also somewhat surprising that while environmental history writing has dwelt upon the colonial policies on scientific forestry and wildlife, there are not as many writings in the early phase of environmental history in India on the domestic animals and how the colonial policies on scientific livestock management and interventions in the field of veterinary medicines impacted peasant lives. In 1983, while reviewing Raymond Crotty's book titled Cattle, Economics and Development, which remains till date an important contribution to the discipline of livestock economics, Schneider had argued that the special role played by livestock and their special relation to agricultural operations in socio-economic systems throughout the Third World has been neglected long enough. Around the same time as environmental history was taking a shape within Indian academia, Hanmant Rao had very candidly admitted, although speaking to his economist colleagues and not historians, that, and I quote, agricultural economics in India have been interested essentially in the economics of crop production and comparatively less in livestock economics. Their interest in rural ecology has been negligible, unquote. The national seminar where he pronounced this opinion was Annual Conference of Agricultural Economics in 1987, where we witnessed for the first time a session titled Impact of Agricultural Development on Ecology and Environment. Even after these reminders, pastoral concerns started to articulate in environmental history only around mid-1990s, and it took around 15 more years for a study of political ecology of cattle management in colonial central India to appear in print as books and as doctoral dissertations. Narrating the impact of colonialism on non-human world, Rangarajan and Shivram Krishnan states that in the early years of colonial rules, the growing British demand for horses and other draft animals as well as animals used for military purposes was mainly met by adapting available Indian practices. They add that over the course of 19th century, the British breeding activities for horse and cattle expanded, and it was increasingly justified in the name of scientific management and development of veterinary medicine. Presenting the history of a colonial institution through government cattle farm Hisar, Caton shows how this farm was started in response to failures to breed adequate number of horses at the Bengal stud and the realization that bullocks had been effective as draft animals in India for a long time. Rangarajan and Shivram Krishnan also reminds us that the curbing of nomadism of itinerant groups in general, the crackdown on Sweden cultivators, the harsh punitive measures against the small but prominent hunting communities, as they were often labelled, have been investigated in various parts of British India. The arrival of railways and printing press in colonial India had far-reaching consequences on the role both played in the reconfiguration of the relations between village and town, and the same has been captured in the writings of thinkers such as Rabindranath Tagore, M.K. Gandhi and B.R. Ambedkar and several others. However, even as these thinkers critiqued the relationship between village and town, communities in some villages on river banks threatened to get displaced due to hydropower dam were organizing themselves to mount an anti-displacement and to some extent an anti-dam protest. Rajendra Vora, in his book The World's First Anti-Dam Movement, Mulshi Satyagraha, 1920 to 1924, traced the emergence of what to him and Madhav Gadgil appeared to be Narmada Bachao Andolan's forgotten predecessor. Early 20th century was also a crucible within which arose the debates from those who were part of the colonial state and administration as well as those from Indian National Congress and anti-colonial bloc, about what is nature and what is development. Reflecting on those moments, Rangarajan and Shivaramakrishnan states, quote, driving by a growing and overt commitment to what David Lutton identified as India's development regime, the colonial state in the early 20th century had come to view its legitimacy in India as derived in good measures from its ability to promote economic development through mastery of natural resources like forests, agricultural lands, and productive domesticated animals. But by the start of World War II, a critique was brewing within the colonial state and its civil society of Anglophile Indians. Most often, they offered documentation of failed efforts to contain the furies of natural calamities and reminded the state of the disasters unleashed and by badly designed landscape engineering or land utilization, be it in the form of rivers or soils eroded by increased extraction of the bounties they had to offer. Figures like Albert Howard and William Wilcox became emblems of this skepticism that combined both a critique of colonial state policy and the attitudes to nature they expressed. Unquote. Talking about the need to pay careful attention to continuities as well as major breaks with the past, Rangarajan and Shivaramakrishnan reminds us that in their own work, they have fluctuated between the two. They state that ruptures did occur as when the imperial state was in the high gear, mainly in the last decades of 19th century, and that similar experiences had underwritten much of the thinking when India's developmental democratic state launched social engineering on a vast scale in the Nehruvian era. They remind us that both these experiences constituted major shifts with profound ecological consequences. In the third module on environmental history, we would like to discuss those years of last century, starting from Nehru's speech Tryst with Destiny. The last module would try to trace what contemporary, not in the sense of our decade or past one, but a past that was not a century away. That sort of contemporary history writing tells us about post-colonial India's walk along the path of development and what implications it had for India's environment as well as for Indian version of environmentalism. In some sense, we would come back to revisit the emergence of this mode of history writing, environmental history, as an effort to theorize the environmental movements of our times and trying to trace their intellectual inspirations in past.